Well, I think one of us should say hello. I would say
Welcome to Coastside Poetry. Thank you all for joining us on this lovely afternoon. I'm Diane Moomey with Steve Long co-hosting. It's Sunday, February 28th, and here we are at an extra February event, another Salon in our Ars Poetica series, where we explore various poetic forms. This program is live streaming on YouTube as we speak, so glad you could all tune in. Today we'll look at two poetic forms, an older one, the Cento, and the newer Duplex. We've invited North Bay poets Meryl, Natchez and Amanda Moore to explain and illustrate these forms for us today. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here. In a moment, we'll ask you to introduce yourselves and the forms, talk about what intrigues you about these particular ones, and read some examples and some of your own. Both Zoom Room and live stream participants are invited to post questions at any time in the chat box. We'll address those in the Q&A. I'm expecting a lively conversation to arise naturally from that. This part of today's event will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel in a couple days. After the Q&A, Steve will turn off the live stream feature and we'll begin an informal read around, starting with one Cento or Duplex poem each and going around again till we get tired. Making this part private gives our open mic poets an opportunity to read material that might be close to the bone, to read new material that might be ragged around the edges, to read something they might wish to submit to a journal that considers a YouTube video as publication. Meryl and Amanda are going to be posting some things in the chat, so do pay attention to that. And I'll be posting a list of the folks who would like to read, although since there are so few of us, we can be quite informal about that. And now please welcome Meryl Natchez and Amanda Moore.
Thank you. Thank you, Diane. Hi, Meryl.
Yeah, Amanda, nice to see you.
It's nice to see you as well. I'm excited we get to talk about these two forms today.
Yeah, I agree. These are forms that I have really enjoyed, especially during this time where we're so disconnected, because they're forms that connect.
Yes. Well, so why don't we just jump in? I figured I would start by talking a little bit about the Cento, or at least my understanding of the Cento. So I did a lot of...
Yeah, I love it when someone else starts.
Well, I think it says a lot about my Protestant Midwestern upbringing that I used to always think of the Cento as cheating, because you take essentially the best works or the best lines of other poems to create your own. But the Cento actually has really ancient roots, which I find fascinating. It comes from the Latin for patchwork or pastiche. And it started, I think, Ed Hirsch talks about first century as being the place where the Cento begins, thinking that it was possibly a way that school exercise worked at a certain point in its history, that was how certain types of writing were taught to people, and then they were adopting poetic styles. We see that it evolves through humor, and they became sort of raunchy or funny, a jokey form, and then eventually, like all things, used to convert paganism into Christianity. So like our calendar and our holidays being put on, or Christian holidays being put on pagan events, that was also a part of the Cento, is taking these pagan texts and turning them into prayers, into hymns, and into religious texts. In more modern times, it is The Wasteland is a famous Cento. Although, Meryl, did you know that when you first read The Wasteland?
I still didn't know that till this moment.
Oh, when I read it in high school, it was never mentioned as a Cento, but it turns out if you look into it, Eliot took from the Upanishads, from Buddhist texts, from Dante. He's drawing lines from all over the place. I don't know if it counts as a true Cento though, because he does remix, and that poem itself was edited so many times that those foundations are obscured in some lines. I think I looked at an annotated version that tried to account for every single adopted text, and it was so overwhelming, I decided I would just mention it, but not spend much more time on it today. But the rules, maybe you know more about the rules than I do, because I think you have encouraged me to be more flexible with my centos. I usually I'm very hardcore. I take one line from a poem and I put it as its own line in my own poem. But what do you find flexible about the form?
I, of course, jumped into the Cento without knowing anything about its history, because that's just the way I do things. And but what appealed to me was the way that you could essentially collaborate with your favorite poets. And this was so I started working in the Cento in the heart of the pandemic. And it seemed like a way that you could take your very favorite poets and converse with them. So them, and then it would lead to a line. And I had books just spread out all around me with my favorite poems. And no, I just got a message that my internet connection's unstable. I hope that doesn't hurt us. And so I felt, and at first I just took exactly a line from one poet and a line from another poet. And I think that is like the rigorous way to do it. But then, you know, there were some times when a line and a half or changing a line break really worked better. And my view is that form is always in service to the poem. And I know that, you know, in some ways the rigidity of a form can make a poem bloom, but also the reverse can happen, is that breaking the rigidity of the rules can make the poem better. And so that's my take on flexibility, is that there were times that I just felt like mixing things up a little bit would really make a better poem. And and I didn't do anything too dramatic, you know, but just a little bit, just a little
Do you
change.
shift verb
words.
tenses? So not verb tenses
No.
or articles.
No, I didn't change words. I just changed either line breaks or didn't take a whole line. I never changed the original words. That was the way I did it. I mean, with any form, I mean, the whole way the duplex evolved was completely original and unique. So with any form, you can do your own thing with it. I did one Cento where I took Evie Shockley and Sharon Olds had written two poems, one to each other. Evie wrote Ode to My Blackness and Sharon responded with Ode to My Whiteness. And I took those two poems and merged them into something I called it Ode to Inseparableness, or We're Inseparable, something like that. And because I felt like they were in fact in conversation and I wanted to mesh them. So that was, you know, sort of more on the dinner party line that you were talking about.
I think that's also more a remix, or at least my understanding of the difference between a remix and a Cento would be that in a Cento, you're really just taking patches as opposed to two poems, melding them together. But you're right, that's just splitting hairs. I think in terms of how the forms work, I don't know that it matters what it's called as long as it comes together. I find the idea of patchwork, I mean, in both of these forms today that we're talking about, the imagery in their naming is really a helpful way to consider it. So the patchwork, I think if I have this gorgeous quilt that I inherited from someone in my family that was made in the 30s with a little bit of all of the beloved fabrics that comprised her wardrobe. And for me, that's a really interesting way to think of what you were talking about, that you had your beloved books spread out in front of you almost like a quilt, and you were sampling from them to create your Centos.
Yeah, and I never, frankly, felt at all that it was cheating. It was enshrining.
I agree now. I guess I should say, I thought that it was cheating until I wrote one. And it was so hard. It was absolutely so hard to think about matching, especially because I was holding myself to more stringent standards at first. I have gone into much more fungible territory where I break in different places. But to match verb forms, I remember spending almost a whole day looking through poems because I knew I needed a dependent clause. and couldn't find it. So I learned later it's not cheating. And in fact, what was really helpful was taking it to my workshop group, which I didn't quite know how to do, right? Because I didn't feel entirely that a workshop could help a poem like that, because you can't change the diction or the syntax, but it was actually a really helpful experience because they pointed out where the logic of the poem was failing. Because, you know, part of the cento is your heart is so involved, or at least for me, my heart was so involved. There were lines I had to get into my centos, and I didn't see the gaps in logic that I was willing to take to get there. So workshopping them really also helped me consider them not cheating and helpful.
Well, Amanda, why don't we read some of the more famous centos that we have thought about preparing for today, and then read a couple of our own.
I love that. So I'm not going to read the whole of the cento that I chose, but I'm looking at Nicole Seeley's Cento for the Night I Said I Love You. And what's so interesting to me about this poem, I did a little more research on cento and the etymology of cento, which, as I said, we get in the English from Latin as patchwork. But in Italian, if you speak Italian, or even if you speak Spanish, you can hear ciento or cento is 100 in Italian. And I was trying to figure out if that comes from the same etymology. It turns out it doesn't. Cento in Italian comes from a Proto-Indo-European root, and it never goes through the same passage as cento. But Nicole Seeley really got into that connection of the word, the homophone, sort of the idea of cento. So she wrote a 100-line cento and samples really widely from a whole host of sources. I did practice. It takes 5 minutes to get through the whole thing, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read the first couple of stanzas. She does this in 10 stanza sections, or 10 line stanza sections. So I'll read maybe the first 3 sections. Cento for the Night I Said I Love You. Today, gentle reader, is as good a place to start. But you knew that, didn't you? Then let us give ourselves over to the noise of a great scheme that included everything that indicts everything. Let us roam the night together in an attempt to catch the stars that drop. White clouds against sky come humming toward me, one closely resembling the beginning of a miracle. There's the moonlight on a carved path, lighting the purple flowers of fragrant June. I dreamed him, and there he was, silent as destiny, like lit by a momentary match. Men are so clueless sometimes, like startled fish, living just to live. We are dying quickly, but behave as good guests should, patiently allowing the night to have the last word. And I just don't know, you know? I never had a whole lot to say while talking to a strange man. So I'll stop there. It goes on, and it's really a lovely combination. And do you hear how just amazingly fluid it feels? All that syntax glued together.
Yeah, I think she does an amazing job of making it feel like a whole original poem.
When you look at the list of, I mean, she's pulling together C.D. Wright and Langston Hughes and Claude McKay and Emily Dickinson and Galway Canal. I mean, it's one, obviously it has to be very voracious because it's 100 lines, but I appreciate really the depth of her sources.
I'm going to read a really short one by Simone Munch called Wolf Cento. I think she wrote a whole book called Wolf Centos, and this is the title poem from that. So if you're interested in the form, this might be a good book to look at. Simone Munch, M-U-E-N-C-H. Very quick, very intense, like a wolf at a live heart, the sun breaks down. What's important is to avoid the time allotted for disavowals, as the livid wound leaves a trace, leaves an abscess, takes its contraction for those clouds that dip, thunder, and vanish, like rose leaves in closed jars. Age approaches slowly, but it cannot crystal bone into thin air. The small hours open their wounds for me. This is a woman's confession. I keep this wolf because the wilderness gave it to me.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. It's a
Meryl, it's fitting to me that you chose Simone Munch too, because what I think of when I think of her is she writes collaboratively a lot. She has a whole book of she edited an anthology of collaborative poems. And I think she did a whole book with Dean Rader that was collaborative. So that really fits your idea of the Cento being this collaborative, community-based, sheltering, repellent kind of form.
Yeah, and I think, you know, right at this moment where we're trying to embrace diversity of all kinds, it's also a way to do that. You can be extraordinarily inclusive in the authors that you select, the poets that you select, and in fact, it says something about you, who you select, and how you juxtapose them, which I think is really interesting also, because one of the rules of the form, which I am very much in favor of not breaking, is that you list in order the names of the poets from whom you have lifted lines. So that like that itself is like an interesting catalog to read. Like if I look at Simone Munch's, her list is Anne Sexton, Dylan Thomas, Larry Levis, Ingeborg Bachmann, Octavio Paz, Henri Michaud, Agnes Nemes-Naji, Joyce Mansour, William Burroughs, Merritt Oppenheim, Mary Lowe, Adrienne Rich, Carl Sandburg. I mean, that's a really interesting set of poets. And I did one Cento, this was really pretty crazy, that I called Translation Cento, in which every line was from a translated poem. So that each line had two sources, the original poet and the translator. And that was really fun. I really loved doing that.
When we get deeper into the duplex, now I want to think about whether if you took two translations of the same poem and tried to create some sort of Cento duplex, that might be too advanced. I need to spend some time really thinking through that.
That's a really interesting idea, because
I don't know.
Translations can be so varied, so different of the same, especially like somebody like Neruda, who is very much translated, right? You can read 4 or 5 very different translations of the same poem by someone like that. That's an interesting project. We got to do that, Amanda.
This is what I love about these forums too, is they can have these very heady applications. But, you know, I use in the New York Times, every couple of weeks, the at-home section has been doing sort of found poem assignments. And there was something about the Cento where they just tell you to take a page of the newspaper and pull out some poetic lines to create your front page New York Times Cento, which begins to create a real sort of poem of the moment, reflects the concerns that are happening. So in the same way that you're saying who you Centoize or who you draw from your Cento says a lot about you. If you do something from the newspaper, it offers you a portrait of the moment.
Well, do you want to read one of your Centos, Amanda?
I will. I think this one is also helpful to think of in terms of a prompt. I keep anthologies all on my laptop and in my phone. Whenever I find a poem that fits into one of the categories of my obsession, I quickly link to it and put it in a Google Doc. So I'm really interested in list poems. I'm interested in poems with reverse structure. I'm always interested in poems about bees. And I'm also interested in poems about the ocean. I think my second collection is going to be entirely ocean poems if I don't stop. They keep coming. So I took as many ocean poems as I could for my source for the Cento that I'll read now. And it goes across many different poets, as you were talking about before, Apollinaire, Mai Dervang, Emily Dickinson, John Hollander, and Walt Whitman. I wasn't particular about the poet so much as that it needed to be a poem about the ocean. So this is called Ocean Patchwork. Maybe needs a better title, but that's where we are now. I have built a house in the middle of the ocean, white, hallucinatory, defying the shifting sand, a geometric progression of loss. I knew the Pacific would teach me to sleep, close my eyes, and I'm a vessel, an inland soul to sea. In the thin breathing spray flung up, I salute the air, the ocean and the land, the rising tide and its slow progress, gutted by gulls, bleached by salt and sun, its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, a few words in the blue void. Shards the sea has tumbled smooth and harmless. I am so small, walking on the beach, each immortal jellyfish, a failure of belief.
Love that. I really do. Thanks, Amanda.
Well, now we have to hear one of yours.
Okay, well, I picked one to read that I fell in love with a title of a poem, and so I used that for the title of this poem. It's called the name for father. The word for father is the same as the word for listen, and it's by Reginald Dwayne Betts. So I'll just read it. The word for father is the same as the word for listen. In the shape of a human body, I am visiting the earth, my throat stoppered with bees. Like an enchanted mirror, the war continues working day and night. No warning birds, no slackening of the river. The ocean on one side is wild, with foam and glitter, and inland among stones, silence enough to fill cisterns. Silence and residue of waters, radio waves, under ungrounded ground. Just this morning, a vulture nodded his red grizzled head at me. Some days the sky is so full of sorrows, like anaconda red tulips, jewels of blood, and the old years blow back with a glow and dust. Now it's gray and pitchfork. Night drips its silver tap. We can agree that these days, everywhere, particular caution is in order. Under its bandage of snow, the field of me is healing, suffering adjacent to a living happiness. That last line is Amanda Moore's. I'm not about
Sounded familiar.
my friends. Amanda, I forgot to ask you about your poem is who you selected from. Do you want to tell us that? And
Oh, I mentioned some of them. So it really was a wide variety. I can go through the whole thing. It's Apollinaire, Elizabeth Spires, Angela Jackson, Linda Hull, Maida Vang, Emily Dickinson, John Hollander, Walt Whitman, May Sarton, Dana Gioia, Matthew Arnold, Rick Barrow, of course, with The Galleons, which is all about the ocean, Stephen Cushman, Ed Hirsch, and that last beautiful line about the jellyfish comes from Karen Solie. How about you?
I'll have to read my list just a second. All right, in order, they were Reginald Dwayne Betts, Milena Morling, Beth Ann Fennelly, Tony Hoagland, Una Mikhail, Forrest Gander, Seamus Heaney, Jane Hirschfield, Troy Jollimore, Ross Gay, Susan Myers, Raymond Antrobus, Lucille Clifton, Tomas Salzman, translated by Sonia Kravitcha, Natalie Diaz, Ann Carson, Victoria Riddell, Gregory Orr, and Amanda Moore.
That really is like standing in front of your bookshelf and looking at it. You've introduced me to some of those poets. I was thinking we could offer some prompts too for Cento's. One of my favorites as a high school teacher, I'm constantly doing those icebreakers. So maybe you've heard the icebreaker where you're asked to contemplate which 3 people, living or dead, you would most like to invite to a dinner party. I think that's actually a lovely conceit for a Cento. Sarah Nichols is a poet who writes Cento. She's amazing. Actually, Meryl, she has Berryman's dream songs. She creates Centos from various of those lines, but she also has a whole collection that's conversation poems between Plath and C.D. Wright. And so that's sort of where I get the idea for this prompt, that think of the 3 people that you would invite to dinner, find some of your beloved texts by those 3 people and put them in conversation. I was even thinking it could be a fun collection because we could ask one another. I'd want to know, Meryl, who are your 3 people? Maybe I could ask my friends their 3 people. And I could create centos, little dinner party centos for each one of my friends.
Well, I certainly wouldn't invite Berryman to dinner, although I adore him. He'd just get drunk and ruin the party. But that's an interesting, they do that in the New York Times book review every week. They ask whoever they're interviewing what people they would like to have at a dinner party. It's an interesting prompt.
Well, now I know that I can steal those and create a whole selection. So I can go through all of the, I know the feature you're talking about, and I could pick the dinner table, the dinner party cento for Yusef Kominyaka, for Sharon. I'm going to go back and do that.
That's a great idea. That is a really great idea. Shall we move on to the duplex? Do we have anything more to say about the cento?
No, I think that's, your prompt would just be gather your beloveds to you, yes?
Yeah, I think the way it works for me is there's a line like that line, the word for father is the same as the word for listen, that I just wouldn't leave me alone. And then I wanted to find things that somehow went with it in some way for me. I could not elucidate for you what way that title fits with the poem, but I feel like it does. And so for me, one line just leads to the next line. And I try to use only lines that I really love, that I think really, I can't remember who said it's much harder to write a good line than a good poem. But I think that's really true.
I actually know the line, but I don't have it exactly in my head. But yeah, it's harder to write a line. Diane, did you want to?
I just wanted to put something to you. If you like, we can have a short Q&A now on the cento and then have the duplex one after, or would you like to wait until the end of your presentation and we'll just have a general? It's completely up to you.
If something feels urgent, we can answer it. But I think what's so interesting about the duplex is the way it sort of becomes a cento-esque form. That there's a way your cento, and certainly Jericho Brown concludes his book with a duplex cento, making centos of his own work. So if there's a pressing question, by all means, let's interrupt and answer it now, but we can adaptively take both topics at the end.
Sounds great. Okay, just wanted to check in. I'll
Thanks,
go quietly
Diane.
now. There.
So Meryl, do you want to kick us off with the duplex?
Sure. I actually learned about the duplex through Amanda because we're both on the board of Marin Poetry Center. And the last thing we do for our board meetings is each one of us reads a poem. And Amanda read something she called a duplex, and I'd never heard of it. And she sent me to this essay on Poetry Foundation by Jericho Brown. And I'll just read one of his because I really think his are quite masterful. I'm going to read this one. Where is it? The opposite of rape is understanding. He calls every one of his duplexes duplex, which is a little annoying, but anyway, that's just how he does it. The rules for the duplex are kind of complicated. You might be able to explain them better than me, Amanda. You're better at explaining. Do you want to before I jump in with this?
I can explain. One of my favorite things is the way I can drop the mouths of all of my students at once by saying, he has one sentence that he says with the duplex. He says, write a huzzle that is also a sonnet, that is also a blues poem of 14 lines, giving each line 9 to 11 syllables. And most everyone will look like, what? But really what it is he creates this echo form. So he creates a first line and finds some sort of spark that gives him the second line. And that's the first couplet. Then that second line is modified or shifted in some way to be the third line of the poem, introduces a fourth line. That fourth line then gets shifted. So it becomes this mirroring or this echoing throughout. And when you get to the very end, the last line goes back to the first line.
Also, the additional thing is that all these lines from his previous work. That's what he says, that he cut his previous poems into lines of 9 or 11 syllables. So I think what he does is the first line is a line from a previous work of his, and maybe the second line also, and then it takes its own form.
From what I've heard, he shows up to workshops on this with baggies of his excised lines. So he takes his poems that he's cut from his manuscripts and he cuts them up into little strips. And actually, I think the Poetry Foundation essay talks about how he puts them all over his house and has different feelings in different rooms. And then I think he describes, actually physically trying to create sparks between two lines before he'll put them in the same stanza.
Well, keep talking for a minute, Amanda. I want to go get my example of that. I forgot to bring
Oh,
it up.
all right. I'll say that the duplex, I was talking about how patchwork is such a helpful way for me to think of the Cento. The idea of a duplex is really helpful for me in thinking of this form, that he talks about it as a single structure with two addresses or 2 points of entry, and thinking, and I think this also builds off of the idea that the Italian word stanza also means room. So he creates this expansive sense of the poem as something we can habitate or we can enter and occupy. And it's united by that shared wall. And yet there are two ways in. And for me, that works both ways. Each stanza, and he really breaks each couplet into its own stanza. So each stanza is its own room, its own sort of duplex with 2 points of entry. But then the way that repeated word shifts or changes becomes that two addresses to the same sort of residence or the same place. And here's Meryl with her. This is how she creates her duplexes and looseplexes.
So the thing that got me when I read this essay about the duplex is, like, if you're like me and you've been writing for your whole life, you have many, 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 many poems that you've worked on so hard, sometimes for years, that didn't work. They just never really quite worked. But you don't throw them out because, you're hoping that one day, it might come together. So when I read Jericho's essay, I didn't quite get what he was doing, but I totally got the idea of cutting up those poems into lines. And some of my lines I loved, right? And so I got these little, first I had them in a big dish, and then they overflowed the dish. And then I got these little they were like reverse sticky tabs. And you just stick the lines on them, and then you can take them off and move them around. And I have several of these big ones. And then when I start picking up lines to make the duplex, I have a smaller one where I gather them and sort of like, oh, this one seems to go with this one, and this one seems to go with this one. And so that's my process. It helps because pretty soon, if you get into this form, which I did really intensely for several months, your whole world is swimming in little pieces of paper. So the baggies, weren't where it was at for me because I wasn't going anywhere. But these big sticky tabs really worked. And also I have to say that at first I didn't really quite understand what Jericho was doing. And so what I did, which I called the looseplex, is different than what he does. So let's start with the duplex that I was going to read, which is Jericho Brown's. The opposite of rape is understanding. A field of flowers called paintbrushes. A field of flowers called paintbrushes, though the spring be less than actual. Though the spring be less than actual, men roam shirtless, as if none ever hurt me. Men roam that myth. In truth, one hurt me. I want to obliterate the flowered field, to obliterate my need for the field, and raise a building above the grasses, a building of prayer against the grasses, my body a temple in disrepair. My body is a temple in disrepair. The opposite of rape is understanding. So I just find that like totally moving and totally wonderful. And so I started reading a couple of his duplexes, which were online. And then what I did was with mine was, I really couldn't do what he was doing. It just didn't, for whatever reason, but I had to do I had to start the same way. I had to start with lines of 9 and there is something really magical about lines of 9 or 11 syllables. I don't know what it is, but it really works. And so what I did, I called the looseplex, and I think I'll just go on and read one of those, although reading it after Jericho's is a little daunting, but nonetheless, just to show you sort of where I went with that. um, I took, these are all lines that I cut and put on my little boards. And this, I did a lot of them, but I'm just going to read this one, Looseplex 5. And I give mine titles because I was so annoyed that all his were called Duplex. So Looseplex 5, praise. Apparently nothing happened in April. More like lichen, the way it fastens on stone. How time stretches, how light bends, how trout go for the glitter of the hand-tied fly. A shaft of light falling on the page. Quiet joy seeps in with wakefulness. The ficus greens by the air conditioner, the incessant ohm of cars on 880. Gravity, that force that threw the green fuse. Anther and filament, tiny winged seeds. Throw in the towel, pick up the trowel. Death too can dazzle, a brilliant flame, and then finish the job and turn into gossamer. Exit this life into ashes and pure air. So you can see mine don't rhyme, they don't echo, but all of those lines came from previous poems. And what that did for me, I mean, I don't know what seeps into the poem for you, but for me, each of those lines carries a lot with it because it carries the failed poem that it came from. And so for me, that effort was extraordinarily pleasurable. I mean, not just the visceral pleasure of cutting up that poem that never worked, but then the pleasure of reusing the lines in a way that for me worked was really magical. And I got a chance when Jericho came to Marin Poetry Center a year ago, March, was it? Yeah, 2 years ago, March. 2 years ago, March, to talk with him for the afternoon and about exactly what he did and what I was doing. And then I actually did write a real duplex once I really understood exactly what he did. But I still didn't like it as nearly as well. I mean, as what I did in duplex.
I find the form really intriguing. When I first learned about it, though, it seemed a very intellectual exercise. I like that you're approaching it with your heart. I wanted to figure out how that repetition works. And it just happens. I actually don't know how close in proximity, but someone else from the Marin Poetry Center board had convinced me to take part in a poem a day challenge for October called the Poeming, which is a found poetry project. And they sample from horror writers for a whole month. It was just seemed like something kitschy and fun to do. And the previous year they had done Stephen King. And so every participant had gotten a Stephen King novel to make found poetry out of. And Sarah Jane Sloat wrote Hotel Almighty, which came out from Saraband this year and is just gorgeous. It is the most gorgeous book of visual found poems. There are erasures that she builds on. And so I signed up thinking, oh, Sarah can do it, I can do it too. And that year we got assigned Christopher Pike, who is a YA horror writer, as far as I can tell, no lyricism whatsoever. Stephen King uses adjectives and adverbs. And I got sent this book that was schlock. It was just teenage horror with no verbs or no adverbs, no adjectives, nothing beautiful. And it was just as I had discovered the duplex. And so I thought, can I make a Cento duplex? Can I, instead of using my own poetry and my own lines as I'm learning about the form, can I lift some things from this novel? Because what I wanted to get good at was that shift, the second entry into the line. I don't think I ever got good at using someone else's. I'm going to read one from that experiment just because I think it's fun. This is never going to leave my hard drive, but I'm taking the lines from a Christopher Pike book called, maybe it was The Sleepover. It was something typical, but what I was really focusing on when I was working on this was how to shift that second line. So this is called You Think Too Much. You think too much. That's your problem. I want to be the one to introduce you to the one you want to be. Introduce you to a guy to fall in love with by lunch. By lunch, fall in love with a guy before you've had a chance to fantasize. Before he's had a chance to fantasize, get past the hello, how are you stage. past the how are you stage with sex, exactly as much as boys want. Boys want sex, exactly. As much as I don't think you should wait until the party for it, you should wait until the party. I think you think too much. That's your problem. So
Nicely done.
not an excellent poem, but it made me more confident when I was ready to really think about his duplexes and what that form could offer my poems. And so I was able to eventually write those more faithful duplexes that I really love. I mean, I think it's a fun form. And Meryl, while you were getting your paper downstairs, I was talking about, for me, it's all about the duality, that single structure with 2 points of entry. So that's why I'm so obsessed with that repetition.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the real duplex is you can't use as many of your found lines because every other line you're changing, right? So the most you can use is half of the sonnet form. They are sonnet.
But it's a lower barrier to entry then. You only need 7 really good lines to make a great duplex as opposed to 14, which you would need otherwise.
That's true. But it has its own trick. I did actually do a duplex after I met with Jericho and understood exactly what he was doing. And I could, like Amanda, this is something that I don't think will ever go out into the world. But I felt like I had to at least do it once now that I understood how to do it. And so I just called this duplex after Jericho Brown. When I first learned one man could love another, men wore suits and women wore aprons. Would he wear a suit or an apron? Bewilderment at the heart of it. A small, bewildered, wild thing, heart waffling, fur up, ears back, panic once the foot falls in. But the foot falls in, everything upside down. He had no choice. He had to take his chances. He took his chances, shoved his chips on the line, one life in this body, then absence, ashes. Absence, ashes make the moment shine. Pupa and larva and iridescent flash. The flash iridescent, his flesh untethered. A world where one man loves another.
No, I love that, Meryl. But that's not going out in the world, you've decided?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's going out in the world. I mean, I feel like I needed to do it, but I feel like if I'm going to do a duplex, it has to be as good as Jericho's, and that isn't. So that's sort of how I feel about it. You know, loose
That's
they're
such a
mine.
high standard. If we were all
Yes.
not writing poems because of those that came before us, I don't know.
Well, I feel like, you know, for the loose plex, that's my form. I'm not quite as I don't have as high a standard for that because that's a form I invented for myself and my own work, and it's meaningful to me. But if you're using someone else's form, if you're just taking something they've invented, I really feel like yours should be at least as good as theirs. My personal feeling.
Well, that's not mine. I think what I love about the form is just, and I think that's interesting. I was looking for my Thea Matthews book earlier. I think I've loaned it out, but I've loved seeing how other poets have approached the duplex and which of his features they keep and which, you know, when I write mine, I even use his same lineation trick, which frees the even numbered stanzas come off from that left margin a little. And I really like that. I know we want to move to questions. I do want to mention though, the final poem in Jericho's book is called Duplex Cento. So you're wrong. They're not all called the duplex. This one is called Duplex Cento. But what's so interesting is that he's choosing lines from duplexes that are in the book previously. So it's remixing his remix in a way. And it's really a familiar experience. If you read the whole book, the trajectory of the book, this is a lovely poem to end on because it pulls all of those in. So I'll read it. Jericho Brown, Duplex Cento. My last love drove a burgundy car, color of a rash, a symptom of sickness. We were the symptoms, the road, our sickness. None of our fights ended where they began. None of the beaten end where they begin. Any man in love can cause a messy corpse, but I didn't want to leave a messy corpse, obliterated, in some lilied field, stench obliterating lilies of the field. The murderer, young and unreasonable. He was so young, so unreasonable, steadfast and awful, tall as my father, steadfast and awful. My tall father was my first love. He drove a burgundy car. I mean, it's just lovely how that repeats so many of the duplexes and the themes of the book.
It is an amazing book. It really is.
I think that's all I have to say on the form.
Yeah, let's open it up to questions.
Okay, that sounds like a super idea. Right. I don't have a question, but there was just one thing I was thinking about in the last workshop I was at. Someone read Cento that she had created all from the works of one poet. Said, this is honoring this poet. So she read this lovely Cento that was all her lines. And the poet was there and was very happy about it.
I love that, Diane. It makes me think of the Golden Shovel, which is in some ways a Cento-esque form that Terrence Hayes created to honor Gwendolyn Brooks. And then you just need one line of a poem or one stanza or even an entire poem for those end words. So it's fun to think of these forms of found poetry as ways to honor the people we're sampling from.
Mm-hmm. Hillary.
I had a question, if I may. With the duplex, trying it and reading up on it, I know Jericho's process, so he took up his words and physically cut them out, but do you always start with your own lines or can you start with a new line? To me, it is kind of the swinging and the echo that's really the heart of the structure. So, but is that usually the process with duplex that you're taking lines you've already had?
I think Meryl and I are going to disagree on it because I will say, I will say you do whatever you want. You find that line. And I teach, it's interesting because Meryl has a whole lifetime of lines she's drawing from. I teach high school students. So asking them to go find their retired poems, that's a non-starter. So having them bring in 7 great lines of a poem that they want to then fashion and play with, I think that's part of them. That's what's so exciting about these newer forms is they're still forming. They're still being adjusted in however we want to inhabit them, as long as we're giving, tribute and homage to where we get the idea. I'd say whatever works. And that's why I wanted to read just my Cento-y one. None of those lines start out as mine, although I try to make them that in the repetition. But Meryl, you can argue with me.
I'm not arguing. I'm just saying if you're going to call it a duplex and you're going to do something different, you should name it something else. That's all.
I don't know though. If you read his article, I don't think he's saying that the duplex is inherently about sampling your own work. For me, he's talking about the same residence with 2 addresses or 2 points of ingress. I don't know.
Well, obviously you can do anything you want to do. You can do anything you want to do. That's the great thing about poetry. There is absolutely no rule that you can't break. So whatever works for you, you should just do. You might just, I think the reason I changed the name of what I was doing, even though I felt like it was extraordinarily derivative of what he was doing, it wasn't what he was doing, that's all. So that's why I changed it. But, that's a trivial point. There are a lot of people working and calling things duplexes that are different from what Jericho does. So feel free, just write, whatever. And Amanda's right, because I tried to teach, my friend up at Chico State had me try to teach a class on the duplex. And the workshop part of it was just a disaster because even college students don't have enough lines to start with. And I didn't know enough to bring a suitcase full of lines, for them to shuffle through. I should have done that.
Hey, Lucy, I saw your hand up. Hi.
Yeah, it seems to me that the loose plex is also a kind of Cento. Do you consider it both like a cross between a Cento and a duplex?
Well, I guess you could call it a Cento of my own work. In that way, it is a Cento because I am taking my own lines and just alternating them in ways that is very much like a cento. And I'm not trying to do what you do in a real duplex with that complete echo and shift of the second line and the fourth line and the, you know. So yeah, that is, you could see it as just making a cento of your own past failed poems in sonnet form using lines of 9 and 11 syllables.
I think that's actually why I proposed we look at these forms together. I very much see the duplex as working in the vein of the cento, although you're patchworking or making the pastiche of your own work, but I think they're related.
The thing for me about both these forms was in the about 3 months into the pandemic, it just seemed like impossible to write anything new because nothing was happening. Nothing new was happening. So these forms came to me as a way to both collaborate. First, I did the duplex, and then I did the cento. And the duplex was just a way to take my own work and work with it in a way that made it new. And then the cento became sort of a way to feel that I was connected to other poets. So especially in a time when you can't actually be connected, or you don't have any fresh inspiration, or you feel stuck, these are great tools to help you keep going.
Yeah, shaking ourselves up. Dave? Yeah, you're still muted, Dave.
Yeah, I found this very interesting. I never used this before, so this is all brand new. And I have I was reading at the time New American Poets. Actually, it's an old, rather an old 1990, 91, and it's New American Poets, edited by Jack Myers and Roger Weingarten. And the thing is, as I was reading, it's my habit to kind of underline certain lines that just mean something to me. And today, when I put all these things together, I was looking frantically for the list of poets whose lines I took, but I can't find that. So one of the things that struck me is, first, I find that I have created a poem that is really not strange, but rather a downer. It's kind of really, very difficult. It is not high tone or anything. It is. It causes me to think that, boy, this COVID has really gotten me down, because the lines that excited me or that I underlined on a lot of these were really rather deep and foreboding or whatever. So you'll hear that later on. So my question is for you both is, do you have something in mind adrift, whether it be lighthearted or whether it be deeper or whatever? Do you have something in mind to begin with? Or are you just, as you go, you find a line that goes with another line and so on, and you let it drift? Do you have some kind of plan, I guess?
I never have a plan, ever.
Okay. That's good.
In anything, life, poetry.
Yeah, I would echo that I think I will begin all of my poems with curiosity, just trying to figure, and especially found poems. And they end up, I mean, I think what you're describing, they've become sort of a way to write our own hearts and our own feelings based on what we're pulling from. I think this is true of any found poetry exercise. What we're drawn to is probably a way to find an expression for what we're experiencing.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think, Brenda Hillman always says, like, a line comes to her as music, and then she follows that music where it takes her. I think that's a really good analogy of how it works for me.
Mhm. And Annie Dillard had a line in her book, The Writing Life, which was referring to the line that drops from the ceiling, something that just falls into her lap, and then the mason. She's using the analogy of like the wordsmith as a mason, taps the other words in around this line, because this line is something that must be kept, you know. And ever since I read that, I became more aware of lines that dropped into my lap, lines that fell from the ceiling. And so that's where most of my poems start, I think. I haven't tried either of these forms, but I would imagine when I do, it'll be like somebody's line in the book that just like, yes, I have to do that one. Lucy?
Yeah, I have another question. And that is, would you call any poem that's created from excerpts from newspaper articles or other texts a cento, even though if it's prose text you're drawing from, you're creating the line breaks yourself, and a piece from a newspaper article could be, you could, make a half a line, you could make it 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines, you could make it a whole stanza. So are all of these different things from prose text centos?
Well, I would call that a found poem more, but I suppose you could make a case for it being a cento. I think traditionally a cento is from other poems, but and a found poem, you can take any words that come to you from any source. So,
but how about, it's different if it's a found poem, if it's from, I think of it as found poem if it's one source, but say you cut up 5 newspaper articles and you're drawing pieces from them and putting them in different orders from what they appear in the original piece, and intermingling them with each other. Would that be a cento?
This is why, for me, I was saying at the beginning that the titles of these forms hold so much weight with me. The fact that the cento is a pastiche or a patchwork makes me think, yeah, what you're doing with a newspaper is, even though traditionally often they come from poems, I still think when you're pulling from multiple articles in the same newspaper or multiple articles in a book, in a scholarly book, that to me is the patchwork or the pastiche that makes it cento. But I do think there's a fuzziness with all genre right now in these liminal spaces in between. A cento and a duplex are both sort of working in the same way. A found poem, which is to me, that's the big umbrella that all of these live underneath, that the remix and the cento and the erasure and the visual poems, that all lives under found poetry. So I don't know. And the exciting thing is maybe it's a cento, or Lucy, then maybe you, like Meryl, coins looseplex and gets to call hers looseplex. Maybe with your newspaper centos, you find a way to name that the nomenclature feels significant to represent what's happening.
The newsplex.
The newsplex, or the newto.
I love that idea, the newsplex. That's great.
Lucy, I'll expect to see one at the next salon. Just
Yeah, I actually have one.
I thought she had a question, but I guess she had to go.
Later today.
So I'm sorry, I think I talked over something somebody else said. I'm sorry.
Oh, I just said I'm sorry that we lost Abby. I know she had a question she didn't get to ask, so.
Oh, she did say that she hadn't been feeling well. So, oh dear. That's the problem as host. I'm trying to make sure that everybody has their moment in the sun, and it doesn't always work out that way.
You do a very good job.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let's see. We could, if there are no more questions, we could stop the recording. Oh, Veronica, yes, there you are, and you're muted. There.
Hi. Uh, I'm so struck by the duplex, particularly the way Jericho writes them, as such a beautiful machine. And to me, it's it's like it has a gear and it's moving from couplet to couplet in that specific way. And somehow I related that to the beautiful machine of a sonnet. And I wondered if when you were with him, if he talked about that as a structure or why it was important for him to use the sonnet and the ghazal, or if he had anything to add about that.
Well, I think that he felt like the sonnet, as you say, is a beautiful machine. And he loved the sonnet, but he wanted to make it new. And so I think when he started with his cut up lines, he was just looking for a way to put them together. And the sonnet became that structure for him. What he did with the echo and the reversals is really, really, I think, his addition to the form. And I mean, when he says it's a sonnet and a ghazal and the blues, I mean, the blues is a repetitive form. The ghazal has a certain couplet repetition form. So, I mean, frankly, myself, I don't see the ghazal in there so much, but I do see the blues. So I see that echo of word and sound that, you know, last night I was broke, I was sitting by my door. Last night I was broke and I didn't have no more. You know, I mean, that kind of basic blues, kind of the way they take a word and they make it into a refrain. I think he was very consciously taking the Black origin of that he could relate to, and taking the intelligence of the sonnet and pushing them together in a way that just struck sparks, and it just works. And what's interesting is how much it works and how it works for so many different writers. It became adopted by so many people almost off immediately. It's fascinating.
And I didn't get to spend the whole afternoon with him, but at dinner I said, do I really, really have to use 9 to 11 syllables? And for him, you know, that became the conversation about breath length. And that to me is very much about the sonnet. That iambic pentameter is our breath length and our heartbeat. He has no interest in the meter of it necessarily, although I think the blues aspect brings a certain meter. And Meryl, when she reads my duplexes, and now I'm creating a new one, a duplex. But when she reads my duplexes, she's always all over my syllables. And really, Meryl, if we're talking honestly, you don't even like 11 syllables in a line. You go 9 to 10, and you're always on my longer lines.
Well, I don't go 9 to 10. I go 9 to 11.
Very rarely are yours 11.
Very rarely are mine 11. That's true. I tend to stick to 9, but that's just, I'm like allergic to length in everything about poetry. All poems are too long. All lines are too long. So, yeah, I don't have a lot of patience. So 9 is a better length for me personally. But really, you shouldn't go more than 11. You really shouldn't. There is some kind of like Fibonacci series impetus to that restriction, that 9 to 11, the breath length, the heartbeat, whatever it is, it really works.
And your cantankerousness about length is also echoed in things I've read Jericho too say about how poems shouldn't be long. He really likes short. He likes the compression as a reader and a writer.
Yeah, not everybody does, I know, but almost everybody could cut a few lines. And then you can use them in a duplex. I worked as a sort of initial editor for the Community of Writers anthology that it's actually coming out next month, and we're going to have a launch at Marin Poetry Center. And I just was so appalled by people sending in 4 and 5 page poems to an anthology. I mean, how could you expect an anthology to give you 4 or 5 pages for a poem, you know? It was just seemed like incredible hubris to me. Needless to say, no 4 or 5 poems made it past the initial screening.
Well, if there's nothing more, I'm gonna stop the recording. And so after I stop talking, there needs to be like a 10-second silence where, you know, I have to hold the smile and we don't say anything because there's a lag between us and the YouTube recording thing. We found this being cut off in mid-word. So if I'm just sitting here glassy-eyed, you know why. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today, Meryl and Amanda. And thank you all for Zooming with us. Please stay online for the next part of today's program. And to everyone who's listening in on YouTube, please consider joining us on March 9th, our next regularly scheduled second Tuesday event, when at 6 p.m. we will host Palo Alto poet J. David Cummings. Thanks again for joining us at Coastside Poetry and for helping to keep the lamps of poetry burning.